Senator Marc Sharry.
Thanks very much and welcome Mr Cardiff again. Just two very quick questions at the beginning which raised. We had John McCarthy in earlier from the Department of Finance, and well, it goes back perhaps to the evidence of the other day. He told me in questioning that his department were vocal and consistent in their recommendation for counter-cyclical policies throughout the period, he said, right from 2001 up, but that this, that's how he put it, circumstances always changed between the agreed budget strategy signed by the Minister and what happened later. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, for most of that time, I wasn't in the division that was given the fiscal, that was working on the budgetary and fiscal package. At times, I was on the tax side, but the people who put it all together were in a different division. So it wouldn't have been me who was doing that. But I mean, yes, I'm aware that we were given advice at different times, and I've read the Wright report like all of you have, and it's clear from that we were given advice. Wright says that we should have been more, I forget the word he says, strident or more vocal at different points than we were.
You mentioned that at different times people would be told, he described it as the pay level above his, not to say certain things, to take certain things out. Would you have been aware of that, and was this political interference or was it pragmatism by the officials who had this authority?
Well, it depends on what a document is about, Senator. If a document is a minister's speech or it's a policy statement or whatever, well, it's the minister's statement, and it's not. So long as we have a democracy, it's not for civil servants to insist. Civil servant, and there's a real question about to what extent the civil service should be an internal opposition. But I don't think ministers particularly ever want it that way. But certainly that you would, if you were framing a response to a parliamentary question or you were framing a public speech, what you would be framing would be the document that you think the minister wants. If you were framing your own advice, that would be different. So if you were framing your advice to the minister, that might have one thing in it. But once the minister has decided a policy, or once there is a policy line for something, then in terms of what you have the minister say, because you draft a speech for him, or a line or a parliamentary question answer, then that's his speech you're trying to draft, not your own.
To what extent, if ever, did the wish to say what the minister wants affect the integrity of the facts?
The facts as spoken by the minister, or the facts as given to him by the officials?
I mean, in an important speech, for example, like the budget, or an important policy directional thing, I mean, what I'm trying to get at, was there political interference to the extent that, let's talk, you said you were in tax, about the tax incentives. Would ministers have said, Mr Cardiff, I am not doing that. We're going to lose votes if we do that. We're not doing that. I mean, did it ever get down to raw vote getting, or was there responsible, mature consideration of policy direction?
I know there'd always be raw vote getting. That's how democracies work, I'm afraid.
And specifically to do with tax incentives and the property tax incentives that we spoke of, did you feel undue? Did you feel that there was an undue influence with regard to that issue, for example?
There was a lot of support by the minister of the day for the evaluation, the very detailed evaluation we did of those tax incentives, and a lot of support also for because it was his decision to phase them out. But I understand, and it's sort of the folklore of the place, that there was, the tax incentives had come about mostly because of suggestions from the political level. I don't recall ever hearing of a property tax incentive being being something that the official level would have thought was a wonderful thing to suggest. But that's not to say there weren't, but in general, we had concerns about property tax incentives, in particular because if you incentivize a lot of things, then the incentive effect actually is reduced. If you have only one property tax incentive, then that policy objective really is incentivized. But if investors have 20 different options, all with an incentive, then the incentive effect for any one of those options is much reduced.
Okay, just one very last question, just to do with the era that really we were dealing with the last day. And that was just on the guarantee. Was there a lobby from anywhere specifically to include the UK subsidiaries of the banks?
Oh, it was more than a lobby. It was an absolute insistence from the UK and from Europe. Was there any political influence in that decision? Were there political parties calling for that? Were there politicians calling for that? Well, the British Prime Minister and their Chancellor were calling for it.
Here in Ireland,
Here in Ireland. I have some vague recollection of someone saying in the Dáil on the guarantee debate that maybe we'd have to look at this, but there was I don't think any party here was seriously pressing for a broadening of the guarantee beyond what it was at.
Okay. At what point post-nationalisation did you become aware of the extent of debt concentration to a small number of debtors? And were there any indications of this debt concentration prior to NAMA acquiring the portfolio?
Oh yes, absolutely. The debt concentrations were becoming quite evident at the very latest by October 2008 in the PwC documentation.
Okay.
One of the things that was regarded as a potential advantage for NAMA would be that it would be able to get more value from particular debtors, because they would be able to concentrate 3 or 4 of their exposures into one place and manage them as a group rather than having them managed separately in 3 different places.
What's your assessment of the ultimate consequences to the state of the decision to contribute the National Pension Reserve Fund?
Of the decision to use Pension Reserve Fund money towards it's neutral.
Sorry?
Neutral.
What do you mean by neutral?
Well, if something had to be done, then it doesn't really matter whether you take it out of your side pocket or your back pocket.
Okay. Why did the government proceed with the amount of $3.5 billion for AIB, given that it was clearly outlined that this amount was insufficient to meet their capital needs, with ultimately them requiring $19.8 billion?
I think you're mixing 3 or 4 different things there, probably deliberately. The $3.5 billion was an assessment at the time, but at the time the assessment was that they needed a couple of billion more, not that they needed 19. And the couple of billion more was to be made up by themselves because they had assets that they could sell, which would accrue to capital. In particular, they had a Polish subsidiary which was sold later. So their plea, if you like, was don't give us more capital. Please, please, not more capital. We'll find it ourselves. We'll find the balance ourselves. So that's why at the time they got less capital than was estimated to be required.
In his witness statement, Patrick Honohan states, one of the measures pressed on the Irish authorities by the Troika, and I'm quoting, was the merger of Anglo with IMBS and that of EBS and the IB. From my perspective, he said, this measure served no strategic purpose. It seemed largely a pointless cosmetic exercise. Could you comment on that statement and these mergers and his view that they were a pointless cosmetic exercise?
67 billion, Senator. If they're giving you 67 billion and they want something that's pointless and cosmetic, if it doesn't hurt you, you say yes.
this view similar to the one given by the central bank at the time?
Can't remember what they were saying at the time about that, Senator. What was really important was not, much more salient, if you like, was not whether those would be merged together. And I gave a slightly glib answer, in part because I don't remember all the discussion. Much more important than whether those would be merged together would be what would happen in their deposits, which, as you remember, were passed on to other institutions. That mattered because if those institutions lost those deposits, they had to rely even more on ELA, which meant that we had to rely even more on the ECB to continue to sanction that. So a lot of our concern about this was not about these rearrangements, was about protecting the deposit base and ensuring that we would continue to have as many deposits in the system as possible, and we were afraid we would lose those. So when the deposits were moved out of IBRC and into other institutions, at the time we were relying on a sort of a tacit agreement from the ECB that would, they would make up the difference and they would allow the difference to be made up in ELA.
So you think it was a good thing?
Well, it was a good thing to, if you could continue, if you were sure you had the funding, it was a good thing to reduce the scale of business to the scale of the balance sheet on both sides of those institutions. Yeah, so it was a good thing to have them made smaller and to have them on a clear path downwards and out. In that sense, yes, definitely.
Back to the line of questioning that Deputy Murphy had in relation to burning of bondholders. Did you watch the evidence of Mr. Trichet at the event in Dublin Castle?
Yeah, I watched a good bit of it. I don't know that I saw it all.
You described, and again, I don't want to be... Yeah, okay. So the words that you mentioned in your report when you said that you would give on the one hand this and the other that, words like fiction, fallacy, hectoring tone, bullying attitude and so on. How would you assess the evidence given by Mr. Trichet on the day?
Well, I think I've said some of it was perfectly accurate. Other pieces I thought were perfectly valid, but maybe he didn't have the whole story. And other bits that were just plain those kind of truths that, every word is true, but the impression is not. And the impression of, as I said very explicitly in my document, the impression that they were simply giving advice simply isn't true.
Would you have a view as to why the ECB preferred to engage in an external meeting with this inquiry rather than come in like yourself under oath to give evidence?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, remember 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when the ECB was set up, there was a legal case quite early on about whether they could be brought to the ECJ, and they fought that very hard. This is to have an absolute belief in their legal position as being independent, and it's not purely self-serving. Remember, some of these people in some of these countries don't have a tradition of independent central banking, or don't have a tradition of a lack of political interference in central banking. Some of these countries have done enormous things to make themselves democracies in a very short period of time, from a transition from a out-and-out dictatorship where nothing was independent. So there's a reality to their desire to be independent, but they try to protect that sometimes in ways that we mightn't all like. And then they have a legal problem. Frankly, I imagine coming and being, directed to attend a committee because they have these various protocols and so forth. Just as just as I would if I were representing the European Court of Auditors here. I would probably come, I'd probably have the same discussion, but I would not allow you to direct me because that would be contrary to the protocols.
Yeah, again, just to cover the Strauss-Kahn issue which you have dealt with, would it be your understanding or not that Minister Brian Lenihan at the time felt that the Irish government were going to be in a position to burn bondholders?
He had one very optimistic day, yeah.
He had one great optimistic day. And you mentioned the call coming in then, which said that Trichet and Geithner were not in favour of this, and presumably this was the call that gave the bad news. Who was that call with?
I imagine we got the news first from the IMF themselves, because they were the ones who were coordinating with Strauss-Kahn. Must have been from there, yeah.
It must have been?
Must have been the IMF people on the ground in Dublin, because remember they were sitting in the building with us at the time. Sorry, just to be clear.
Yes.
Well, I mentioned Trichet and Geithner because they're sort of documented, but there were other countries on that call too, and I don't know who was for and who was against. I don't know if there really was a global consensus as
who would be on that call if it was G7? I mean,
well, the UK would probably be on it. The Canadians may have been on it. The French, the Dutch. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe not the Dutch. So I don't know.
And have you learned anything since that you could share?
No, after 6 months of fighting with the US Treasury over an FOI request, they gave me one document that was irrelevant. I was almost admiring their manner of handling it.
Okay.
You could have a document if you wanted, Deputy, but it's not very helpful. It is, though, documented in Geithner's book, in part. And so, I put the relevant extract in my statement because that's... So we know what happened to an extent, but what we don't have is the documentation because we weren't on the call. So the only documentation I have found is Geithner's book. But I can tell you what was recounted back. And it was confirmed on phone calls I might have with counterparts in the Treasury that, yeah, sort of Geithner was against, but the way it was put to me was he wasn't the only one.
And I'm sorry, can you remember a passage in the book? Did it not say that he found Trichet more animated than he ever found him, or something to that effect?
Well, I don't remember it, but I can do better because it's in the statement. You have it there, I'm sure.
Okay. Have you any view on why Trichet, for example, would not have accepted the arguably more experienced position and authority of the IMF on matters such as these in the context of burning bondholders?
Yes, because Mr. Trichet was trying to hold together the entire EMU project. So we're there, we have a particular national problem, and we're fighting hard. And he's trying to think, well, what's the implication of this for the entire Eurozone? So he's a different perspective. And what was really important to us might seem to him, that to achieve a saving of several billions, if we got a 15% reduction on that 19, that would be nearly 10 billion. Well, that was really important to us, but for him, if you're sitting in Frankfurt and you're saying 10 billion and we put at risk the whole project, you might think it's not worth doing. So
who were the beneficiaries of Ireland's not burning of the bondholders?
Well, the people who held the bonds, who would be...
Well, we know that, but I mean in the European context, who had to gain?
Well, I imagine Irish bank and government bonds were broadly held across Europe and the US. So I would have thought that most large investment funds around Europe would have some small exposure.
You said last week when we spoke, and I asked you, had Ireland's action saved the euro? And you said that it had, but so too had the actions of other countries. How many other countries proportionately paid bondholders in a similar way as us?
Well, no one paid as much as us.
Nobody. So is it fair or not to say that in the context of saving the euro that the Irish people have done most?
Well, in the context of saving the euro and saving ourselves, we've spent more than anybody else. And we've made a much greater fiscal effort than almost everybody else. I mean, the Portuguese and the Greeks have similar problems. The Greek problem is unfortunately quite a bit deeper even than ours. So, I mean, your heart goes out to them. If ours was bad, how bad it must be there.
As you've mentioned, Greece, their negotiating approach, with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything differently?
My remarks last week were reported in the Greek financial papers. This is not a fair conversation to have. They're in the middle of a really shite problem, so let's leave them alone.
Okay. The other issue I wanted to ask you about was on the 18th of November, Patrick Honohan did an interview with Morning Ireland, and there are various views of the implications of why that interview took place, and no doubt we'll be speaking to Mr. Honohan tomorrow about that. Can you give us your view as to why it happened and the implications of it?
Okay. Like every other country in Europe, we've set up an independent central bank. And we've explicitly in law said to the governors of those central banks, even more so incidentally in Ireland than other places, because we put a great deal of responsibility on the governor himself as opposed to the board. And we said you're independent and you have to act in the public good, but entirely independently of government. So he took a view that was different to the ministers and different to mine at the time as to when was the time to talk more openly to the Irish public. I think, in truth, there was only a day or two in it. I mean, it was very clear at that stage we were having gone in the lingo from contacts with the EU IMF to, by then, what were being called short and focused discussions actually in Dublin. I mean, it was clear that there was a momentum building. I think probably what Patrick said on the Thursday, the minister would probably have been willing to say himself on the Friday evening. So I wasn't especially upset by it. I thought, well, I wouldn't have done it, but it's, you know, he has to do his duty as he sees it. I think Minister Lennon thought the same, because there was no sense of rancour between them afterwards. I think they just saw each other as doing a slightly different job. It was a little bit, I would have liked an hour more notice of it, that's all.
Would the independence of the governor of the central bank, which of course we all respect and uphold, in that instance, do you feel Mr. Honohan was acting as governor of the Central Bank of Ireland or council member of the European Central Bank?
Well, he has a legal obligation in relation to his duties as a council member of the European Central Bank. And he would probably never be able to say this himself, but I never saw a moment when I didn't think he was working for Ireland.
Do you feel the dual role sometimes is bad, not necessarily specific to Mr. Honohan, but where does one's national responsibility stop and the fiduciary duty to membership of the governing council take over?
It's a complex thing for a person who's in that situation to manage. But remember, the alternative is not to have an Irish governor sitting on the council of the ECB, and that would be a bad thing, I think. Is
it something that's clearly defined?
No, it's clearly undefined.
Okay, so it's a grey area.
There is nothing written down as to how you manage that conflict. But it is written down that, of course, you are there that you have responsibilities as a member of the governing council, and you have to adhere to those.
So it could be a case, perhaps, or not, of when one is in Frankfurt, one is an ECB governing council member, and when one is in Dublin, they are not.
No, I think one is always in a complex situation.
Yeah,
I don't think that it changes because you're in Dublin or Frankfurt. You have to work two jobs. A lot of people do that.
Very finally, do you feel that the interview that morning, the 18th of November, strengthened or weakened the Ireland position in the context of negotiations at that time, in terms of options available?
We had already done a lot of negotiation by then. In fact, I mean, we had done so on the basis of what ifs, because we couldn't run ahead of government agreements. Everything was done very closely with the minister, so the officials were not running ahead of the minister, but the minister was having to manage this. The prior discussion was all about if we were to join a program, what would be the terms? So by then, we were at that point where a lot of if you do, then the terms will be X, Y, and Z. A good deal of that had been discussed. So I'm not sure, so long as his statement didn't lead the other side to start rowing backwards and say, well, we could get more, then it wouldn't have made a huge difference. I don't think it did make an enormous difference to the end point.
Some?
Well, we'll never know, but
Okay, thank you, sir.
Probably not.
I'll bring you back in.
Thanks.
I just want to